Peter Pan by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 1. Peter Breaks Through. All children, except one, grow up. They know that they will grow up. It was the same for Wendy, too. One day when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden. She picked another flower and ran with it to her mother. She looked so lovely, and her mother, Mrs. Darling, put her hand to her heart and said, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever?" She didn't want Wendy to grow up. But Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. 2 is the beginning of the end. They lived at number 14. Mrs. Darling was the most important person in the house until Wendy came. She was a lovely lady with a romantic mind and such a nice, mocking mouth. Her romantic mind was like small boxes, one within the other. There is always one more. You cannot find out all of the boxes. And on her sweet, mocking mouth there was always a kiss. Wendy could never get it, but the kiss was always there. When she was a young girl, the boys around her understood that they were in love with her at the same time. So they all ran to her house to ask her to marry. Mr. Darling understood that he loved her too, and he was the first to ask her to marry him, because he took a car instead of running. He got her, but he couldn't get the kiss and the box in the very center of her mind. He never knew about the box, and later he stopped trying for the kiss. Mr. Darling always told Wendy that her mother not only loved him, but also respected him. He was a good businessman, and he knew much about it. It would make any woman respect him. Mrs. Darling was married in white, and at first she was good at spending less and saving more. But later, she drew pictures of babies instead of writing down the expenses. Wendy came first, then John, then Michael. For a week or 2 after Wendy was born, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were anxious. They thought they wouldn't be able to look after her. They didn't have much money. Mr. Darling started to calculate expenses, but Mrs. Darling wanted to leave the things on their own. She might wait and see. But that was not Mr. Darling's way. His way was with a pencil and a piece of paper. And if she confused him by talking, he had to begin at the beginning again. "Now, darling, I have £1.17 here, and 2 6 at the office. I can stop drinking coffee at the office, then 10 shillings. Don't speak, sweetheart. And you have 18 3. It would go on like this for minutes. Then he would ask, 'Can we try it for a year on 997? "Of course we can, George," Mrs. Darling said. She was on her daughter's side. But Mr. Darling wanted to know clearly how much money they needed for looking after a baby. He calculated the expenses of childhood illnesses, but differently each time. At last, Wendy won. They calculated everything perfectly. There was the same excitement over John and Michael, but both were born, and soon all 3 started going to Miss Folsom's kindergarten school. Mrs. Darling loved to have everything properly, and Mr. Darling wanted to be exactly like his neighbors, so of course they had a nurse. They were poor, and the children drank too much milk. This nurse was a dog. She was called Nana, and she always thought children important. They met her in Kensington Gardens. She spent most of her time watching the babies in the gardens. The Darlings thought she would be a good nurse. She was so careful at bath time, and she was up at any moment of the night if one of the children cried. Of course, she lived in the nursery. She knew whether the children were ill or not if she listened to their cough. She escorted the children to school, walking by their side. She never forgot John's sweater, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth in case of rain. There is a room in the kindergarten school, and the nurses wait there. They sat on chairs while Nana lay on the floor. That was the only difference. She would keep the nursery properly, and Mr. Darling knew it. But he sometimes thought that the neighbors would talk about it, for he had his position in the city, and he had to be careful with it. The Darlings would dance all together, and sometimes their only servant Liza would join them. How joyfully they danced all night! The most joyful was Mrs. Darling, with the lovely kiss on her mouth. There never was a happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. Every good mother would do it at nights after her children are asleep. They put things in order for next morning. It is like tidying up drawers. If you could be awake, you would see your own mother doing this. It is very interesting to watch her. She finds her children's thoughts and keeps the nice ones. When you get up next morning, you see that the naughtiness and bad thoughts of yesterday are all away. On the top of your mind there are beautiful thoughts ready for you. Think! A child's mind is confused and goes here and there all the time. There are zigzag lines on it, and these lines can be the roads in the island, the roads of the Neverland. Yes, the Neverland is an island with great colorful stones, fast ships, lonely caves, tailor gnomes, rivers, princes, one very small old lady in her very old house. The Neverland is such an island. Yet, it is not all. In a child's mind, there is also first day at school, religion, father, a round pool, chocolate pudding day, murders, tooth decay, and so on. It is all confusing, because nothing will stop moving. Of course, the Neverland is different in each child's mind. In John's mind, for example, there was a lake with flamingos flying over it. And in Michael's Neverland, there were flamingos with the lake flying over it. John lived in a boat on the sands, while Michael lived in a tent, and Wendy in a house of leaves. John had no friends. Michael had friends at night. Wendy had a little wolf with her. But in the end, all the Neverlands were nearly the same. On this magic island, children play. We too played there when we were children. We can still hear the sound of the island, though we shall not go there any more. The Neverland is the most comfortable island of all. It is not big and in an untidy way, but it is small, nicely protected and warm. When you play at it by day with chairs and tablecloth, you are not afraid of it. But before you go to sleep, the island becomes very nearly real. So there are night lights. Sometimes in her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found interesting things. She could not understand them. Peter Pan was one of these. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds. Wendy's mind was full of Peter. The name stood out in bigger letters than any of the other words. When Mrs. Darling looked at the name, she felt that it seemed cocky. Yes, he is very cocky, Wendy accepted with a sad look when her mother asked her about Peter. But who is he, my love? He is Peter Pan, you know, Mother. At first, Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she just remembered a Peter Pan. He lived with the fairies, and there were strange stories about him. These were all she remembered about Peter Pan. When children died, he went part of the way with them so that they should not be afraid. Mrs. Darling believed in him at the time, but now she was a married adult. She was not a child anymore, and she was not sure about such person. He must be grown up by this time, she said to Wendy. Oh, no, he isn't grown up. He's just my size, Wendy said. She didn't know how she knew it. She just knew it. Mrs. Darling talked to Mr. Darling about it, but he smiled and said, It must be one of Nana's nonsense ideas, just the sort of a dog's idea. There cannot be such a thing. But there was, and soon this cocky boy gave Mrs. Darling a shock. Children have the strangest adventures without being afraid. Wendy talked about such an adventure one morning. There were some leaves on the nursery floor, and Mrs. Darling was sure that these leaves were not there when the children went to bed. Wendy said, "I believe it's that Peter again." "What do you mean, Wendy?" "It's so naughty of him not to clean," said Wendy. She was a tidy child. Later, she told her mother that Peter sometimes came to the nursery in the night and sat on her bed and played on his pipes to her. She never woke, so she didn't know how she knew. She just knew. "You talk nonsense, my love. No one can get into the house without using the door," said Mrs. Darling. "I think he comes in by the window," Wendy said. It was the third floor, but the leaves were very near the window. Mr. and Mrs. Darling didn't know what to think, but at last they were sure that she was dreaming. But Wendy didn't dream. The strangest adventures of these children began the next night. Mrs. Darling was sitting with a calm smile on her face in the nursery. The 3 children were sleeping. The fire was warm, and there were 3 night lights by the children. Suddenly, Mrs. Darling fell asleep. She had a dream. In her dream, the Neverland came too near, and a strange boy broke through from it. She wasn't afraid of the boy, but later she saw Wendy and John and Michael in the Neverland. While she was dreaming, the window of the nursery suddenly opened, and a boy dropped on the floor. There was a little strange light with him. His light was like a living thing. I think this light wakened Mrs. Darling. She gave a cry and saw the boy, and somehow she knew at once he was Peter Pan. He was very like Mrs. Darling's kiss. He was a lovely boy with a dress of leaves. But the most fascinating thing about him was that he had all his first teeth. Chapter 2. The Shadow. Mrs. Darling screamed, and the door opened. Nana entered. When she saw the little boy, she showed her teeth and then sprang at the boy. He jumped out of the window quickly, and Mrs. Darling ran down into the street to look for his little body, because she was afraid that he was dead. But he was not there. She returned to the nursery and found Nana with something in her mouth. It was the boy's shadow. When he jumped out of the window, his shadow didn't have time to get out, and Nana caught it. Mrs. Darling looked at the shadow carefully. At first she didn't know what to do with it, but then she thought of showing it to her husband. But he was so busy, and she decided to wait for a better time. So she put the shadow away carefully in a drawer. The better time came a week later. It was a Friday. What an unfortunate day! All said the same thing about that Friday. Mrs. Darling: "It was a big mistake to have gone to that party." Mr. Darling: "No, darling, I am responsible for it all. I did it." Nana: "It was my fault." That Friday was all about a dinner party and a tasteless medicine. They would sit there in the empty nursery, thinking of every smallest detail of that Friday evening. It was like 100 other evenings. Mrs. Darling was washing Michael in the bathroom, and Wendy and John were playing in the nursery. Mrs. Darling was in her white dress, and her husband was dressing for the party. After Michael's bath, it was time for the children to go to bed. They were all in the nursery when Mr. Darling came into the room with his tie in his hand. "This tie it will not tie, not round my neck," said Mr. Darling. He was never good at wearing a tie. "Let me try, dear," said Mrs. Darling. She tied his tie for him with her nice hands. He thanked his wife, and then he forgot his anger. Now he was dancing round the room with Michael on his back. They remembered that Friday evening with great sadness. "How joyfully we danced," said Mr. Darling. "I remember. They were so sweet, don't you think, George?" asked Mrs. Darling. "And they were hours, and now they're gone." When Nana entered the nursery that evening, Mrs. Darling thought it was the right time to tell him about the boy and his shadow. At first, Mr. Darling didn't believe the story, but then he looked at the shadow carefully and said, "I don't know such a person, but he looks like a naughty boy." They were talking about the boy when Nana brought the medicine bottle in her mouth. Although Mr. Darling was a strong man, it was certain that he behaved foolishly over the medicine. "No, no, I won't take the medicine," cried Michael. "Be a man, Michael. When I was your age, I took my medicine without saying a word," said his father. "Yes," said Wendy to help her father. "Even your medicine is much more tasteless, isn't it, Father?" Then she ran to get her father's medicine. In fact, Mr. Darling didn't want to take the medicine, but he had to make Michael take his. They decided to take their medicines at the same time. 1, 2, 3, and Michael took his medicine, but Mr. Darling put the glass behind his back quickly. All the children were upset. "Oh, Father!" Mr. Darling wanted to make them forget about the medicine and quickly said, "Look, I have an idea. Let's make a joke. I will put my medicine into Nana's bowl. She will drink it, thinking it's milk. What fun!" When Nana returned, she ran to the medicine and began drinking it. Then she gave Mr. Darling the saddest look. All felt so sorry for the dog. "Oh, George," said Mrs. Darling, "it's your medicine." "It was only a joke," he said. "Why should you care about the dog instead of your father?" He was angry and he said, "I won't let her stay in my nursery any longer. She will live in the backyard." All the children cried. Mrs. Darling said, "Remember what I told you about that boy." But Mr. Darling would not listen. He wanted to show his power. He took the dog and tied her up in the backyard. Mrs. Darling put the children to bed, then lit their night lights. They could hear Nana barking. "That is not Nana's unhappy bark," said Wendy. "She barks in this way when she smells danger." "Danger! Are you sure, Wendy?" "Oh, yes." Mrs. Darling didn't like it and went to the window. It was closed tightly. The night was full of stars. "Oh, how I wish that I wasn't going to a party tonight," she said. She kissed the children and sang to them. "Mother," said Michael, "I am so happy that you are a mother." They were the last words she was to hear from him for a long time. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were walking to number 27. It wasn't too far, and the stars were watching them. Stars are beautiful, but they just look on. They don't move. Stars are not friendly to Peter, because Peter always tries to blow them out. But they love fun so much that they were on his side tonight. As soon as the door of 27 closed on Mr. and Mrs. Darling, the smallest of all the stars said joyfully, "Now, Peter!" Chapter 3. Come away, come away. For a moment after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the beds of the 3 children continued to burn clearly. They were nice little night lights, but suddenly all 3 went out. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights. It ran here and there, entered all the drawers in the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow. It was not really a light. It made this light by flashing about so quickly, but when it stopped for a moment, you saw it was a fairy. It was as small as your hand, and it was a girl named Tinker Bell. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window opened and Peter dropped in. "Tinker Bell," he called softly after making sure that the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for the moment. "Oh, come out of that jug and tell me, do you know where they put my shadow?" There came a lovely sound of golden bells. It is the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it, but if you heard it, you would know that you heard it once before. Tink said that the shadow was in the drawer. Peter jumped at the drawers and in a moment he had his shadow, and in his happiness he forgot that he shut Tinker Bell up in the drawer. He and his shadow would join like the drops of water. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but it failed. Peter was so upset, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs wakened Wendy up, and she sat up in the bed. She was not surprised to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only happily interested. "Boy," she said kindly, "why are you crying?" Peter could be so polite, too. He learnt to be polite at fairy ceremonies. He rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased, and bowed beautifully to him from the bed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," she said. "What's your name?" "Peter Pan." It seemed to her a very short name. "Is that all?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He felt for the first time that it was a shortish name. "I'm so sorry," said Wendy. "It doesn't matter," Peter said. She asked where he lived. "Second to the right," said Peter. "Then go straight on until morning." What a funny address! For the first time Peter felt perhaps it was a funny address. "No, it isn't," he said. "Do they write it on the letters?" "I don't get any letters," said Peter. "But your mother gets letters," said Wendy. "I don't have a mother," he said. Wendy felt very sorry for him. "Oh, Peter, you cried because of this," said Wendy, and got out of bed and ran to him. "No, I didn't cry about anything. I can't stick my shadow on." Wendy saw the shadow on the floor. She was very sorry for Peter again, but she knew what to do. "I shall sew it on for you, my little man," she said. He was as tall as herself, though. She sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. Soon his shadow was with him. Peter was very happy, and he started to dance, "How clever I am!" He was a cocky boy, really. But for the moment Wendy felt angry. "Of course I did nothing!" She went into bed and closed her face with her blankets. Peter sat on the end of the bed and touched her gently. "Wendy," he said, "one girl is more used than 20 boys." Now Wendy felt better and said, "Do you really think so, Peter?" "Yes, I do." "I think it is perfectly sweet of you, and I will get up again," said Wendy. "Now I shall give you a kiss," said she. But Peter didn't know what a kiss was. He opened his hand toward her and waited. Wendy didn't want to make him feel bad, so she gave him a thimble. Peter gave her a button, then, "Now I give you a kiss, too," he said. Wendy said she would wear his kiss round her neck. It was lucky that she put it on, because it was to save her life later. Wendy asked Peter how old he was. "I don't know," he said. "I ran away when I was born." Wendy was surprised, and she listened to his story carefully. "I heard Mother and Father talking about me," he said. "They wanted me to be a man in the future, but I don't ever want to be a man. I want always to be a little boy and to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long time among the fairies." Wendy was very surprised again. She asked a lot of questions about fairies. He told her about the beginning of fairies and said, "But now children know a lot and they don't believe in fairies. If a child says, 'I don't believe in fairies,' a fairy falls down dead somewhere." Peter suddenly remembered Tinker Bell, because she was very silent for moments. "I can't think where she is," he said, and called Tink by name. Wendy was very excited. "Is there a fairy in this room?" "She was just here now," he said. "You don't hear her, do you?" And they both listened. There was the nice sound of bells. "That's the fairy language," Peter said. "I think I shut her up in the drawer." As soon as Tink got out of the drawer, she started to fly about the room angrily. "Oh, how lovely," said Wendy. But Tink was not kind to her. "You mustn't say such things," said Peter. "She says you are a great ugly girl." Wendy and Peter were together in the armchair now, and Wendy asked him, "Where do you live now?" "With the lost boys. Children are sent far away to the Neverland when they are lost, and I am captain." "What fun it must be!" "Yes, but we're lonely. You see, we have no girls there. Girls never get lost because they are very clever." Wendy liked the way Peter talked about girls. "Oh, you are so kind," she said. "Then you can give me a kiss." But she remembered Peter didn't know about kisses. Then she said, "I don't mean a kiss, I mean a thimble." "What's that?" he said. "It's like this," said she, and kissed him. "Funny," said Peter. "Now I will give you a thimble." As he kissed her, Wendy gave a cry. "Someone pulled my hair." "That must be Tink," said Peter. Tink talked angrily. "She says she will do that to you, Wendy, every time I give you a thimble," said Peter. "But why?" "Why, Tink?" Again Tink answered. "You silly boy." Peter could not understand why, but Wendy understood. "Wendy, your mother always tells you such lovely stories. I came to the nursery window to listen to stories," said Peter, "and none of the lost boys know any stories." "I know such lots of stories. I can tell you all of them," said Wendy. "The stories I could tell to the boys." Peter was happy to hear it, and he held her arm and began to draw her toward the window. "Wendy, come with me and tell the other boys." She said, "Oh dear, I can't. Think of my mom. Besides, I can't fly." "I will teach you. Oh, Wendy, there are mermaids." "Oh, to see a mermaid." "And Wendy, we all respect you. You can feed us at night. Nobody cooks for us. And you can sew us our clothes and make pockets for us. None of us has any pockets." She liked this idea. "Peter, would you teach Michael and John to fly too?" "Yes," said Peter. Then Wendy woke both of them up. "Get up," she said. "Peter is here to teach us to fly." But no, something was wrong. Nana was quiet now. Her silence was not normal. "Turn off the light! Hide! Quick!" cried John. And Lisa entered the nursery with Nana. The room was dark, and the children's breathing was loud as they slept. They all were behind the window curtains. Lisa was angry with Nana because she was busy in the kitchen. "They are perfectly safe, aren't they? All are asleep in bed. Are you happy now, Nana? If you bark again, I shall go and bring Mr. and Mrs. Darling home from the party, and then Mr. Darling would punish you again." She tied the unhappy dog up in the backyard again. But Nana didn't stop barking, and at last she broke her chain. In another moment she ran to bring Mr. and Mrs. Darling home. At the same moment Peter began to teach them to fly. They all failed at first. "How do you do it?" asked John. "You just think lovely, wonderful thoughts, and they make you fly in the air," said Peter. It was not true, of course. They had to have some fairy dust on them. But Peter didn't say anything about it. He had his fun. His laugh was the loveliest one. He had his first laugh still. It was a perfect baby laugh. Then he blew some fairy dust on each of them. They all flew perfectly. "Look at me!" Peter gave Wendy a hand at first, but Tink was so angry, and Peter had to leave Wendy's hand. Up and down they went, and round and round. John and Michael wanted to go out, but Wendy was not sure. "Mermaids," said Peter again, "and there are pirates." "Pirates!" cried John. "Let's go then." It was just at this moment Mr. and Mrs. Darling ran home. When they looked up at the nursery window in the middle of the street, yes, it was still shut. But the room was full of light, and they could see 3 little shadows on the curtains. Not on the floor, but in the air. Not 3 shadows, but 4. They ran upstairs quickly. Will they reach the nursery in time? If so, the children will be safe, but there won't be any story to tell. But the little stars saw them, and the smallest star of all cried, "Peter, look out!" Then Peter knew there was not a moment to lose. "Come," he said, and John, Michael, and Wendy followed him. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana came into the nursery too late. The birds flew out. Chapter 4. The Flight. Second to the right and go straight on until morning. It was the way to the Neverland. But even birds with maps couldn't find the Neverland with this description of Peter's. You see, Peter just said anything that came into his head. They enjoyed flying round the tall objects on the way they flew. Now they could fly around the world rather than a room. They were over the sea when Wendy began to think about their flight. How long ago did they start to fly? She didn't know. But John thought it was their second sea and their third night. Sometimes it was dark and sometimes light. And now they were very cold and again too warm. But they were sleepy, and that was a danger. For the moment they fell asleep, they fell down. The worst thing was that Peter thought this funny. "There he goes again," he would cry as Michael suddenly dropped like a stone. "Save him! Save him!" cried Wendy. Then Peter would fly toward him and catch him just before he could fall into the sea. Peter always waited until the last moment. Peter could sleep in the air without falling because he was so light. "Be more polite to him," Wendy said to her brothers. "You must be nice to Peter. What could we do if he were to leave us?" "We could go back," Michael said. "How could we find our way back without him?" "Well, then we could go on," said John. "We have to go on because we don't know how to stop," said Wendy. This was true. Peter forgot to show them how to stop. They could now fly strongly, but they still needed Peter's help to pass through clouds. When Peter was not with them, they felt lonely up there. He could go so much faster than they. He would have some adventure and he would come down laughing, but he couldn't tell them about it because he would forget his adventures. "And if he forgets them so quickly," said Wendy, "how will he remember us?" It was true. Wendy sometimes had to tell him her name. "I'm Wendy." He was very sorry and said, "If you see me forget you, just say your name." It did not make Wendy happy, of course. When they reached the Neverland at last, Peter said, "There it is." They all knew the island at once. It was like a familiar friend to them. They knew the flamingos and the lake, John's boat and Michael's tent, Wendy's little wolf, and the caves. Peter was a little angry with them for knowing so much about the Neverland, but when the sun set, the island got darker, and it was enough to make the children feel afraid. In the old days at home, the Neverland was always a little dark and fearsome by bedtime, but you were happy that there were the night lights, and Nana was there with them, so the Neverland was just a dream, looking nearly real. It was certainly real now. It was darker and darker every moment, and where was Nana? They flew close to Peter now, and Peter was more serious. "They don't want us to land," said Peter. "Who are they?" asked Wendy, but he could not or would not say. Sometimes he stopped to listen and watch the darkness. Then he went on again. "Do you want an adventure now, or would you like tea first?" Peter asked John. "Tea first," said Wendy quickly. But John was not sure about tea. He asked, "What kind of adventure?" "There is a pirate asleep just beneath us. If you like, we'll go down and kill him." John was so excited, but he wanted to have tea first. "Who's the captain now?" asked John. "Hook," answered Peter. He hated that word. Michael and John were about to cry now because they knew Hook's reputation. "He is the worst of the pirates." "That's him," said Peter. "Is he big?" "He is not so big as he was before," said Peter. "I cut off a bit of him." "You?" "Yes, me," said Peter. "What bit?" "His right hand. And he's got an iron hook instead of a right hand," said Peter. "And there's one more thing. Every boy under me has to promise something to me." John's face got whiter now. "It is this. If we meet Hook in open fight, you must leave him to me," said Peter. "I promise," said John. Tink was with them, and in her light they could see each other. Then Peter said, "Tink tells me that the pirates saw us before the darkness came, and they got the big gun out. If they see her light, they fire the gun." The children were very afraid now. They told Peter, "Tell her to put out her light." "She can't put it out. Fairies can't do it. The light just goes out of itself when she falls asleep." "Then we must hide her light." Peter had a happy idea. John's hat! They put Tink in it, and Wendy carried her. Tink didn't like to be in Wendy's hands, of course. After they hid the light completely, they flew on in silence. But the pirates fired the gun at them, and the great sound ended their silence. Thus the children learnt the difference between a dream island and a real one. John and Michael found themselves alone in the darkness. Luckily, the gun hurt none of them. However, the wind of the shot carried Peter far out to sea, and the wind carried Wendy away too. She was not alone. Tinker Bell was in the hat, and the hat was still with Wendy. Tink was not all that bad, or rather, she was all bad just now, but on the other hand, sometimes she was all good. And at the moment, she was full of jealousy of Wendy. Wendy could not, of course, understand what Tink said, but it was bad words, certainly. Tink flew back and forward, and her sound was so nice. Wendy thought that Tink wanted to help her. What else could poor Wendy do? She didn't know that Tink hated her, so she went after Tink to her destruction. Chapter 5. The Island Comes True. As soon as the Neverland felt that Peter was on his way back, the life on the island again woke up. In his absence, things are usually quiet on the island. On this evening, the Lost Boys were out looking for Peter. The pirates were out looking for the Lost Boys. The Redskins were out looking for the pirates, and the wild animals were out looking for the Redskins. There were now 6 boys on the island. The number would change when any of them got killed. And when they seem to be growing up, Peter sends them away from the Neverland. Growing up was against the rules. There they come, one by one, looking for their captain, Peter. Toodles is the first. He was the most uncomfortable of all. He was kind and brave, yet he had fewer adventures than the other boys. But tonight there is a danger in the air for you, Toodles, because Tink will use you in her plan against Wendy. Be careful with Tinker Bell. He wouldn't hear us, of course. We are not really on the island. Next comes Nibs. He is cheerful and confident. Then comes Slightly. He always dances and plays the flute. He thinks he remembers the days before he was lost. Curly is the 4th boy. He is very naughty. And last comes the twins. But we can't describe them because neither we nor Peter knew what twins were. And the twins were not sure about themselves either. Then we hear the pirates on their ship. They always sing the same bad song. Now we see the crew. The handsome man, Italian Cecco. That big black man behind him is Guajomo. Here is Bill Jukes. Cookson and Gentleman Starkey and Skylights and the Irish Smee are some of Hook's crews. They all make people afraid. And the captain is James Hook. He had the iron hook instead of a right hand. He called his crew as dogs, and the crew did perfectly what he wanted. He was a dark man with long curly hair. It made his face fearsome for others. His eyes were blue, and once you saw them you could never forget. Though his eyes were sad sometimes, his manners were noble. He was good at telling stories, and he was most polite even when he killed you. He used the words perfectly. He was brave, yet there was still something that he was afraid of. Seeing his own blood made him so afraid. It was thick and of an unusual color. He dressed like Charles II and in his mouth he would smoke 2 cigars at once. But the most fearsome part of him was his iron hook. Peter Pan's enemy was such a terrible man. Who will win? After the pirates passed, the redskins came silently. They had hatchets and knives in their hands. Their bodies were naked, but there was paint and oil on them. When they killed boys or pirates, they took their scalps off and wore them. They were the Pickney tribe, and they were not soft-hearted like other tribes. Among them there were Great Big Little Panther, Tiger Lily, and many other brave redskins. The only sound they made as they passed was their heavy breathing. As soon as they went past the forest, there came the wild animals, lions, tigers, bears, and other smaller beasts. They all look for some delicious food, and they are all man-eaters. Their tongues are out. They are hungry tonight. When they passed, the last of all comes, a big crocodile. We will tell later who she is looking for. All are careful with the danger round them. This shows how real the island is. The boys were close to their underground home now. Every one of them said, "I wish Peter would come back," though they were all physically larger than their captain. "I wish he would come back and tell us more about the story of Cinderella," said Slightly. Cinderella was the story Peter heard when he was at the nursery window of Darling's. Toodles was sure that his mother was very like Cinderella. It was only in Peter's absence that they could speak of mothers. Peter certainly didn't want them to talk about mothers. While they were talking, they heard a sound. It was that terrible song of pirates. But where are the boys? They are no longer there. They escaped as quickly as possible. Now they are already in their home under the ground, a nice little home. But where is the door? There is no door. When you look closely, you can see a cave, and there are 7 large trees. Each tree has a hole as large as a boy. These are the 7 entrances to the home under the ground. Hook wanted to find these gates. Will he find it tonight? Only Nibs didn't go home because he wanted to learn what the pirate's situation was. But the Irish Smee saw Nibs running away. He took his gun out to shoot at the boy, but Hook stopped him. Now for the first time we hear the voice of Hook. It's a black voice. "Not now! Put back that gun first!" "It was one of those boys you hate. I would kill him at once," said Smee. "Yes, and the sound of your gun would bring the redskins upon us. Do you want to lose your scalp?" said Hook. "Shall I go and kill him with Johnny Corkscrew?" said Smee. He always had nice names for everything. His knife was Johnny Corkscrew. He had many other lovable manners. For instance, after he killed something or someone, he would clean his glasses, not his gun or knife. "Not now, Smee," Hook said darkly. "He is only one, and I want to kill all the 7. Then he sent the crew away to look for the boys. The pirates went among the trees, and in a moment their captain and Smee were alone. Hook breathed deeply. We don't know why it was. Perhaps it was because of the soft beauty of the evening. But he had a sudden feeling to tell the story of his life. He spoke long and seriously. But Smee was rather stupid, and he did not understand anything Hook said. "Most of all," Hook said, "I want their captain, Peter Pan. He cut off my arm. I will kill him with this." He looked at his iron hook. "But isn't it better to have an iron hook instead of a hand? A hook is better for combing the hair and other homely uses," said Smee. "Yes," the captain answered. "If I was a mother, I would want my children to have an iron hook instead of a hand when they were born." He looked at his iron hook again. "Peter cut off my arm and gave it to a crocodile," said Hook. I often thought why you were so afraid of crocodiles, said Smee. Not of crocodiles, Hook corrected him, but of that one crocodile. He spoke in a lower voice this time. It liked my arm so much that it always follows me from sea to sea and from land to land. It wants to eat the rest of me, said Hook. He sat down on a large mushroom, and now he went on speaking. Smee, he said, that crocodile, by a lucky chance, swallowed a clock, and the clock works tick-tick inside it. So, before it can reach me, I hear the sound, tick-tick. He laughed. Some day, said Smee, the clock will stop working. Then he'll get you. Yes, he said, and it is what I fear most. The mushroom Hook was on was now hotter, and he said, This seat is hot. He stood up. I am burning. They looked at the mushroom carefully. It was not a usual one. It was different from the other mushrooms on the island. They tried to pull it up, and it came away in their hands. Smoke began to come out of it. The pirates looked at each other. A chimney! They found the chimney of the home under the ground. The boys would put the mushroom on the chimney when enemies were around. There came also children's voices. They thought they were safe at home. The pirates listened to the voices, and then they put back the mushroom. They looked around them and saw the holes in the 7 trees. Did you hear them say Peter Pan is away from home? Smee said. Hook thought for a long time. At last he had his plan. What is it? Asked Smee. To return to the ship, Hook said, and cook a big cake with green sugar on it. There is 1 chimney, so 1 room. They had 7 doors for 1 room. They are not clever enough. That shows they have no mother. We will leave the cake on the shore. They always swim there and play with the mermaids. They will find the cake and eat it all. Because they have no mother, they don't know how dangerous it is to eat such cake. He laughed loudly. And they will die. Smee and Hook danced and sang that terrible song together, but a sound stopped their singing. It came nearer and nearer. Tick, 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 tick. The crocodile, he cried. It was after Hook. He and Smee ran away at once. And the boys came out of their house to look for Nibs. Nibs came running and said to them, I saw a wonderful white bird. It's flying this way. What kind of a bird do you think? I don't know, said Nibs, but it looks so tired, and it says, Poor Wendy. Poor Wendy. See, it comes, cried Curly, showing him Wendy up in the sky. Wendy was now nearly over them. They could hear her cry. But Tinker Bell's voice was clearer than Wendy's. The jealous fairy pinched Wendy each time she touched. Hello, Tink, cried the boys. Tink said to them, Peter wants you to shoot Wendy. When Peter wants them to do something, the boys don't ask anything. They just do it. Quick, let's do what Peter wants. Tink showed Wendy to them and began to wait cheerfully. Quick, Toodles, quick, she said. Peter will be so happy. Toodles excitedly fired at Wendy, and Wendy fell to the ground with an arrow in her breast. Chapter 6. The Little House. Foolish Toodles stood like a hero over Wendy's body. You are too late, he cried. I shot Wendy. Peter will be so pleased with me. Silly ass, said Tinker Bell, and hid quickly and happily. The others did not hear her. Now they were round Wendy, and as they looked, a terrible silence fell upon the forest. Slightly was the first to speak. This is no bird, he said in a sad voice. I think it must be a lady. A lady? Said Toodles. He felt a shaking over his body. And we killed her, said Nibs. They all took off their caps. Now I see, Curly said. Peter wanted to bring her to us. He threw himself sadly on the ground. "A lady to take care of us at last," said one of the twins, "and you killed her." They were sorry for Toodles, but sorrier for themselves. When he took a step nearer them, they turned from him. Toodles' face was very white. "I did it," he said. "When ladies would come to me in dreams, I said, 'Pretty mother, pretty mother.' But when at last she really came, I shot her." He moved slowly away. "Don't go," they cried. "I must," he answered. "I am so afraid of Peter." It was a tragic moment when they heard Peter come. "Peter!" they cried. They stood in front of Wendy's body to hide her. Peter dropped in front of them. "Hello, boys!" he cried. They welcomed him, and then again was silence. Peter was angry. "I am back," he said. "Why are you not pleased to see me?" They opened their mouths, but no words would come. "Great news, boys!" he cried. "I brought at last a mother for you all." Toodles dropped on his knees. "Did you not see her?" asked Peter. "She flew this way." "Ah, me," one voice said, and another said, "Oh, what an unlucky day." Toodles stood up now and said quietly, "Peter, I'll show her to you." So they all stood back and let Peter see Wendy. After he looked for a little time, he did not know what to do next. "She's dead," he said. He took the arrow from her heart and looked at the boys. "Whose arrow?" he asked angrily. "Mine, Peter," said Toodles. "Kill me with this arrow, Peter." Peter wanted to do that also, but at the same time Nibs cried, "The Wendy lady! Look at her arm!" All looked at him, and then Wendy, because she moved her arm. Nibs went to her and listened. "I think she said, 'Poor Toodles.'" "She lives," said Peter. He went to her and found his button. You remember she wore his button round her neck. "See," Peter said, "I gave her this kiss and it saved her life. The arrow hit the button." "I remember kisses," Slightly said quickly. "Let me see it. Yes, that is a kiss." Peter did not hear him. He wanted Wendy to get better quickly, so that he could show her the mermaids. Of course, she could not answer yet. "Listen to Tink," said Curly. "She's crying because Wendy lives." Then they had to tell Peter of Tink's crime. Peter was so angry with her. "Listen, Tinkerbell, I'm not your friend anymore. Get away from me forever." She flew to him, but Peter sent her away with his hand. Then Wendy moved her arm to Peter, and Peter said, "Well, not forever, but for a whole week." Do you think Tinkerbell was grateful to Wendy for making Peter change his mind? Oh dear, no. She still disliked Wendy strongly. Fairies are really strange. "Let us take her down in the house," Curly said. "Yes," said Slightly. "That is what one does with ladies." "No, no," Peter said. "You must not touch her. It would not be a kind thing." "But if she lies there, she'll die," said Toodles. "Let us build a house round her," cried Peter. They were all pleased with the idea. "Quick," said Peter, "bring me your best things." In a moment they were as busy as tailors the night before a wedding. They ran here and there, went this way and that. While they were at it, John and Michael came suddenly. You can be sure they were happy to find Peter. "Hello, Peter," they said. He was very busy at the moment, seeing how large a house Wendy would need. Of course, he wanted to leave room for chairs and a table. John and Michael watched him. "Is Wendy asleep?" they asked. "Yes." Then Peter said to Curly, "Get those boys to help in the building of the house." "Build a house?" cried John. "For Wendy," said Curly. "Why, she is only a girl," said John. "That is why we are her servants," said Curly, and took the boys away to help the building. Peter thought of everything. "Slightly," he said. "Bring a doctor." "Yes, yes," said Slightly at once and went away. He knew he must do what Peter wanted. Of course there was no doctor on the island, but Slightly came back in a moment. He had John's hat on his head and looked serious. "Please, sir," said Peter, "are you a doctor?" At such a time the other boys knew it was a dreamlike game, but to Peter, dreamlike and real were the same thing. "Yes, my little man," answered Slightly. "Please, sir, a lady lies very ill," said Peter. Slightly went to Wendy and put a glass thing in her mouth. Peter waited. "How is she?" he asked. "She'll be better. I will call again in the evening. Give her some tea." Then he gave the hat back to John. Slightly finished his work as a doctor. They were building the house when one of them said, "Oh, how I would like to know what kind of house she likes." Then Wendy moved into her sleep and opened her mouth. "Perhaps she will sing in her sleep," said Peter. "Wendy, sing about the kind of house you would like to have." Without opening her eyes, Wendy began to sing. "I wish I had a house, the littlest pretty one, with small red walls and a roof of green." They were happy to hear it, because they already painted the walls red. The house was quite beautiful, and Wendy was very safe and warm within it. And they built the door lastly. "Finished now," they thought. Peter knocked politely on the door, and they waited silently for Wendy to open it. The door opened, and a lady came out. It was Wendy. They all took off their caps. She looked surprised. "Where am I?" she asked. Of course, Slightly was the first to answer. "Wendy, lady," he said, "for you we built this house." "Oh, please say you like it," said Nibs. "Nice, lovely house," Wendy said. They hoped she would say these words. "And we are your children," cried the twins. "Oh, Wendy, lady, be our mother," cried all. "It's nice to hear it, but you see, I am only a little girl. I don't know much about being a mother." "That doesn't matter," said Peter. "We need just a nice motherly person." "Very well, I will do my best," said Wendy. "Come inside at once, and before I put you to bed, I will finish the story of Cinderella." In they went, and that was the first of the many happy evenings they had with Wendy. By and by, Wendy put them to the great bed in the home under the trees. But she herself slept that night in the little house. The little house looked so warm and safe in the darkness. The chimney smoked beautifully all night. Chapter 7. The Home Under the Ground. The next day, Peter measured Wendy, John, and Michael for hollow trees. You remember, Hook thought the boys didn't need 7 different trees as doors. But he was wrong, because if your tree didn't fit you, it was difficult to go up and down, and none of the boys were the same size. Once you fitted, you drew in your breath at the top, and down you went as fast as possible. But you must fit, and Peter measures you for your tree as carefully as for a suit of clothes. The only difference is that a tailor makes the clothes that fit you, while Peter makes you fit the tree here. If you are not suitable for the tree, or the tree has a bad shape, Peter does some things to you. And after that you fit. Once you fit, you must be careful with your size, because if you get fatter, you cannot fit the tree anymore. Wendy was pleased with this idea. Wendy and Michael fitted their trees at the first try, but Peter had to do some things to make John fit his tree. After a few days' practice, they could go up and down quickly. They loved their home under the ground. There was one large room. In this room, colorful mushrooms grew. The children used them as seats. Across the fireplace, Wendy dried the clothes she washed. The bed was against the wall all day, and they put it down in the evening. It filled nearly half of the room. All the boys slept in this bed. Only Michael slept in a basket, because there had to be a baby, and Michael was the smallest. Tinker Bell lived there too. Her room was a hole in the wall, and a little curtain closed it. When we looked at her bed, mirror, and carpets, one could say Tink's room was more beautiful than the boys'. Wendy usually had so much to do. She was sometimes never above ground for weeks. Cooking and sewing for the boys, washing and cleaning, she was always busy. As time went on, did she think much about her mother and father? This is a difficult question, because it's impossible to say how time goes on in the Neverland. It's difficult to calculate here. But I am afraid Wendy did not really worry about her father and mother. She was sure that they would always keep the window open for her to fly back. There were still some things making Wendy uncomfortable. One was that John didn't remember his parents well. And other was about Michael. He began to believe Wendy was really his mother. Wendy wanted them to remember their old life, so she set them examination papers about their parents like at a school. The other boys were also interested in it. They wanted to sit around the table and take the questions too. All the questions were about parents. What was the color of Mother's eyes? Who was taller, father or mother? Write a paragraph on the characters of father and mother. Those were the kind of questions they were. When they could not answer them, Wendy told them to make a cross. It was really terrible to see how many crosses John made. Peter didn't join them. He didn't like mothers except Wendy. And he could not read or write, not the smallest word. And the questions were all in the past tense. You see, Wendy began to forget too. Adventures, of course, were of daily things. Peter would have a strong interest in a game, and then he could suddenly lose his interest in it, and he would leave the game. It always happened in that way, and pretending not to have any adventures was one of those games. In this game, Peter would sit on a chair like he didn't have any exciting adventure. It was such a comic thing to see Peter so serious, but of course he left this game soon. He often went out alone, and when he came back, you were never sure whether he had an adventure or not. He would forget it all, so he would say nothing about it. But when you went out, you would find a dead body. Or one day he would tell about a great adventure, but you could not find a thing about it, nor a dead body. However, there were many real adventures, because Wendy and other boys were in them too. The difficulty is which one to choose. Shall we tell about the fight with the Redskins? Perhaps a better one would be the night attack by the Redskins on the house under the ground. They were too fat for the hollow trees. Or we shall tell how Peter saved Tiger Lily's life in the Mermaid's Lake. Tiger Lily soon became a friend of Peter's. Or we could tell of the pirate's cake. Wendy didn't let them eat the cake, and just then the cake became as hard as a stone. Later, the boys put the stone-like cake on Hook's way, and he just fell over it in the dark. We can tell of the Neverbirds, how they sat on their eggs, although they fell into the water in their nest. They were all Peter's friends. There is one more about the lake. It was Tinker Bell and her fairy friends. They put Wendy asleep on a big leaf and let it go by the water. Luckily, Wendy woke up and swam back. Or there was the adventure of Peter with the lions. Which of these adventures shall we choose? I think we must talk about the lake first. Chapter 8. The Mermaid's Lake. If you shut your eyes, you can see a shapeless pool of lovely colors in the darkness. And if you are a lucky one, the colors become so bright that you think they must go on fire. But just before that fire, you see the lake. And if you have one more minute, you can see the bubbles on the water and hear the mermaids singing. The children often spent long summer days on this lake, swimming or playing the mermaid games in the water. But the mermaids were not friendly to the children. It was what Wendy was upset about most. All the time she was on the island, she never had a word with them. They swam toward and lay on Marooner's rock, combing their hair in a lazy way. Whenever Wendy saw them, she would swim close to them, but the mermaids saw her and jumped into the water, splashing her with their tails. Only Peter was good friends with them. He would go and talk with them on Marooner's rock for hours, and he sat on their tails. He gave Wendy one of their combs. The best time to see the mermaids is when the moon is up in the sky, and the mermaids gave such strange cries. But the lake is dangerous for people then, because the water rises by the moontime, and many sailors drowned there before. Wendy was often at the lake on sunny days after rain. The mermaids, then, came up in great numbers to play with their bubbles. They played with the colorful bubbles like balls. The bubbles took their color from the rainbow. They threw the bubbles each other with their tails. It was such a nice thing to watch them playing, but they never let the children play with them. But we are sure that they liked to watch the children secretly when they played by themselves. One could see the children resting on a rock for half an hour after their lunch. Wendy wanted them to do this, so they lay there in the sun while she sat beside them and looked important. It was one such day, and they were all on Marooner's rock. The rock was not much larger than their great bed, so they all knew how to fit on it. They lay with their eyes shut, and Wendy was busy with her work. While she sewed, a change came to the lake. Little waves ran over it, and the sun went away and the shadows turned the water cold. Wendy could no longer see her needle, and when she looked up, the beautiful lake became most unfriendly and fearsome. She knew it was not night, but something as dark as night came over the lake. No, worse than that. It was coming. What was it? Peter would always feel the danger. He stood up quickly and began to listen as a dog. He put one hand to his ear and didn't move. "Pirates!" he cried. The others came closer to him. A strange smile was on his face now. When the boys saw that smile on his face, they would stand ready to obey him. "Jump into the water!" said Peter. All the children did what Peter told them. Suddenly, the Marooner's rock was all alone in the water. A boat came near. It was a pirate boat with 3 people in it. They were Irish Smee and Starkey. The third one was Tiger Lily. Her hands were tied, and she knew what was to be her end. The pirates would leave her on the rock, and she would die by the rising waters. It was a terrible death for her, but she was calm because she was the daughter of a chief. She had to die as a chief's daughter. It was enough. Smee's Irish voice was to speak first. "Here is the rock. Now we will put the redskin onto it and leave her there to drown." They put the beautiful girl on the rock quickly. Quite near the rock, Peter and Wendy were under the water. Sometimes one would see their heads up and down. Wendy was very sorry for Tiger Lily. There were 2 men against 1, and that made Peter angry. He decided to save her. Peter didn't want it to be an easy way, so he didn't wait until the pirates went away. There was almost nothing he could do now, and he now spoke in the voice of Hook. "Ahoy there, you foolish men," he said. It was a perfect imitation. "The captain," said the pirates in surprise. "We are putting the redskin on the rock," said Smee, looking for the captain around. "Set her free," said Peter. "Free," the pirates cried. "Cut her ties and let her go." "But captain—" "At once, don't you hear?" cried Peter, "or I will kill you with my hook." "Do what the captain wants," said Starkey. As soon as Smee cut Tiger Lily's ties, she, like a fish, jumped into the water. Of course, Wendy was proud of Peter's cleverness. but she knew he would speak in a cocky way, and this would make the pirates understand the truth. So she wanted to close Peter's mouth with her hand, but there came Hook's voice again. "You in the boat!" This time it was not Peter. Hook himself was there. Peter was surprised. Hook was in the water, swimming to the boat. He reached the boat at last. Wendy was so afraid that she wanted to swim away at once, but Peter didn't move. "Am I not clever? Oh, am I not clever?" he said to Wendy in a low voice. Now they listened to the pirates secretly. "Captain, is all well?" the two asked Hook. But there came no answer. "What is up, Captain?" Then at last he spoke. "The game is up," he cried. "Those boys found a mother." Wendy was proud of herself this time. "What's a mother?" asked Smee. Wendy was so shocked that she cried, "He doesn't know!" Peter pulled her beneath the water, for Hook said, "What was that?" "I heard nothing," said Starkey, and as the pirates looked they saw a strange thing in the water. It was the nest, and the never bird was on it. "See," said Hook, "that is a mother. What a lesson! The nest is in the water, but would the mother leave her eggs? No!" Hook's voice was softer, but soon he was as hard as a stone again. "Captain," said Smee, "could we not kidnap these boys' mother and make her our mother?" "It's a great plan," cried Hook. "We'll catch the children and carry them to the boat and throw them into the water, and then Wendy shall be our mother." And Wendy forgot herself. "Never!" she cried. "What was that?" But they could see nothing. "Do you agree, my men?" asked Hook. "Yes," said they. By this time they were on the rock, and suddenly Hook remembered Tiger Lily. "Where is the redskin?" "That's all right, Captain. We let her go," answered Smee. "Let her go?" cried Hook. "You told us to do so." "You called over the water to us to let her go," said Starkey. "No, I didn't say such a thing," said he. It was strange, and the pirates were uncomfortable very much. "Spirit that is here on this dark lake tonight, do you hear me?" asked Hook in a strange voice. Of course, Peter didn't keep quiet. He answered in Hook's voice. "I hear you, fool." "Who are you, stranger? Speak," Hook asked. "I am James Hook, the captain of the pirate ship." "You are not, you are not!" Hook cried angrily. As in all the great pirates, there was a strong inner sense in Hook's dark nature. Suddenly, he tried a word game with the voice. "Hook," he called, "have you another voice?" Now Peter could never resist a game, and he answered this time in his own voice. "I have." "And another name?" "Yes, yes." "Vegetable?" asked Hook. "No." "Animal?" "Yes." "Man?" "No." "Boy?" "Yes." "Wonderful boy?" "Yes." Hook was surprised. "You ask him some questions," Hook said to his men. "Can't you know? Can't you know?" said Peter cheerfully. "Do you leave the game? You lost it." "Yes, yes," they said. "Well then," cried Peter, "I am Peter Pan." "Pan! Into the water, Smee! Starkey, stay in the boat. Take him dead or alive." "Are you ready, boys?" said Peter in his happy voice. "Let's beat some pirates." The fight was short, but a bloody one. First John climbed into the boat and held Starkey. Here and there a head was up in the water. Smee and Toodles were fighting in the water too. Then Starkey pressed slightly and the twins hard farther from the rock. Where all this time was Peter? He waited for the biggest game, of course. The others were all brave boys, but Hook was the one Peter looked for. Strangely, it was not in the water they met. Hook and Peter climbed onto the rock at the same moment. Neither knew that the other was coming. In surprise, they touched each other's arm. They were face to face on the rock now. Peter was not afraid. He had one feeling only, real happiness. Quickly, he got a knife from Hook's belt, but he saw he was higher up the rock than Hook. It would not be a fair fight then. He gave the pirate a hand to help him up. It was then that Hook bit him. Peter was shocked. It was not the pain, but the unfairness. It made him quite helpless. No child forgets the first unfairness, except Peter. He often met it, but he always forgot it. I think that was the real difference between him and all the other children. So when he met it now, it was like the first time, and he could just look helpless. Then Hook hit Peter twice with his iron hand. A few minutes after, the other boys saw Hook in the water swimming for the ship. His face was all white. The crocodile was after him. Now the boys looked for Peter and Wendy, for they were lost. The boys went home shouting, "Peter! Wendy!" But no answer came. They trusted Peter so much that at last they went on. Peter and Wendy would reach home by themselves. When their voices died away, there came cold silence over the lake. "Help! Help!" was the only sound. Peter pulled Wendy up the rock and then lay down beside her. He saw that water began to rise. He had to tell Wendy the truth. "We're on the rock, Wendy," he said, "but it's growing smaller. Soon the water will be over it." She didn't understand. "We must go," she said. "Shall we swim or fly, Peter?" He had to tell her. "Do you think you could swim or fly as far as the island, Wendy, without my help?" She was too tired. "I can't help you, Wendy. Hook wounded me. I can neither fly nor swim." "Will we die here?" she asked. "Look how the water is rising." They put their hands over their eyes for not to see this end. As they sat there with closed eyes, something as light as a kiss touched Peter. It was the tail of a kite. Michael made it some days before, but it flew up in the wind. "Michael's kite!" said Peter. Now he had a great idea. "It can carry you." "Both of us," said Wendy. "No, it can't," said he. "And you a lady." He tied the tail around her, although she didn't want to go without him. But Peter pushed her from the rock, and in a few minutes she was up in the sky flying. Peter was alone on the lake. The rock was very small now. Peter was not quite like other boys, but he was afraid at last. He felt something strange, and he stood up on the rock again with that smile on his face. His heart was in his mouth, and it was saying, "To die will be a big adventure." Chapter 9. The Never Bird. Before Peter was quite alone, he heard the sounds of the mermaids. They were at their home in the caves under the sea now. The waters began to touch Peter's feet, and he watched the sea to pass the time. He saw a piece of paper on the lake. It was fighting the water and swimming toward Peter. It was not really a piece of paper. It was the Never Bird. It was on her nest and trying to reach Peter. She came to save him, to give him her nest, though there were eggs in it. She told him why she came, and he told her what he was doing there, but of course they could not understand each other's language. She brought the nest against the rock, then she flew. She left her eggs. Then at last Peter understood and caught the nest. He thanked the bird, and he got into the nest. The bird flew over Peter to see what he did with her eggs. There were 2 large white eggs, and Peter took them and thought for a moment. Then he suddenly saw a hat on the stave. Didn't I tell you about the stave? It was on the rock, and long ago someone had put it on the rock to show the place of some treasure. The stave was still there, and on it Starkey forgot his hat. Peter put the eggs into this hat and set it on the lake. It swam on the water beautifully. The Never Bird was very happy now. She flew toward the hat and once more sat on her eggs. All were quite happy when Peter reached the home under the ground. Every boy had adventures to tell. But perhaps the biggest adventure of all was that they were few hours late for bed. Chapter 10. The Happy Home. One important result of the fight on the lake was that it made the Redskins their friends. Peter saved Tiger Lily's life, and now she and the other Redskins would do anything for Peter. All night they sat above and watched over the home under the ground. They waited there to save Peter from the pirates. They called Peter the Great White Father and respected him too much. He liked this strongly, but it was not really good for him. "The Great White Father," Peter would say to them in a very lordly way, "is happy to see the Redskins saving me from the pirates." "Me, Tiger Lily, Peter Pan saved me. Me, his very nice friend. I will not let pirates touch him," would say beautiful Tiger Lily. "It is good," Peter Pan spoke. Always when Peter said, "Peter Pan spoke," it meant that the Redskins must now shut up their mouths. And they did so. They respected Peter very much. But they were not so respectful to the other boys. It made the boys very angry, of course. Now we reach the most fearsome evening. There will be great adventures, and the boys will call this evening Night of Nights. We will tell it later. But before that night, everything was normal. The Redskins were above, while below the children were having their dinner. Peter was out to get the time. On the island, if you wanted to know the time, you must find the crocodile and then stay near it until the clock struck it in. There was too much noise, and Wendy cried, "Silence!" It did not make her angry, but her rule was that they must never hit each other at dinner tables. If they had a problem, they must move up the right hand politely and say, "I complain of so-and-so." But they usually forgot to do this, or did it too much. "I complain of Nibs," said Slightly. The twins said, "We complain of John." "I complain of the twins." "I complain of Curly." And it would go on like this. "Oh dear," cried Wendy. "Having children is a big problem sometimes." Now the dinner was over, and Wendy began to sew, while the boys played around her. There was such great happiness on their faces as they danced. But we are looking on it for the last time. There was a step above, and Wendy said, "Children, I hear your father's step. Let's meet him." Peter was happy that night. Then the first twin came to Peter. "Father, we want to dance." "Dance, my little son," said Peter. "But we want you and Mommy to dance too." Peter was really the best dancer among them, but he said, "Me? My bones are old for dancing." "But it's Saturday night," Slightly said. It was not really Saturday night, but always if they wanted to do anything special, they said this was Saturday night, and then they did it. But first they had to wear their pajamas. At this moment, Peter came to Wendy and said, "There's nothing better than an evening for you and me when the day is over, because we are such a good family with little children." But Peter looked uncomfortable. "Peter, what is it?" Wendy asked. "I was just thinking," he said. "It's only a game, isn't it? That I'm their father?" "Oh, yes," said she. "You see, it would make me look so old to be their real father," said Peter. "But they are ours, Peter, yours and mine." "But not really, Wendy?" he asked. "Not if you don't want it," she said, and then asked, "Peter, what feelings do you have for me?" "A son's love for a mother," said Peter. "I thought so," she said, and went and sat by herself at the end of the room. "You're so strange," said Peter. "Tiger Lily is just the same. She wants to be my something, but she says it's not my mother." "No, it's not, Mother, of course," said Wendy angrily. "But a lady mustn't tell what it is." "Then Tinker Bell will tell me, perhaps," said Peter. "Perhaps Tink wants to be my mother." "You silly ass!" cried Tinker Bell angrily. "I almost agree with Tink," said Wendy. But still Peter didn't understand what it was. None of them knew it was to be a fearsome night. They spent their last hours dancing and singing in their pajamas. They told stories before it was time for Wendy's good-night story. They all got into bed for her story. The boys loved it most, and when Peter hated it strongly, usually when she began to tell this story, he left the room or put his hands over his ears. But this night he stayed to listen to it, and we shall see what happened. Chapter 11. Wendy's Story. "Listen then," said Wendy. "There were one gentleman and a lady." "Oh, there is a lady. She's not dead, is she?" asked the first twin. "Oh, no. I'm so happy that she isn't dead," said Toodles. "Are you happy, John?" "Yes, of course." "Are you happy, Nibs?" "I'm so happy." "Are you happy?" "Oh, dear, a little less noise there," said Wendy at last. The gentleman's name was Mr. Darling, and her name was Mrs. Darling. "I think I knew them." Michael was not sure. They had 3 children, but one day all the children flew away to the Neverland. Now I want you to think of the feelings of the unhappy mother and father. Their children were all away. "Ooh," said the boys, though they didn't think of anything. "Think of the empty beds." "I'm afraid that the ending won't be a happy one," said Nibs. "If you knew how great is a mother's love, you would not need to be afraid," said Wendy. Peter hated this part most. "A mother always leaves the window open for her children to fly back. So they stayed away for years and had a lovely time. Did they ever go back?" "Yes, they did. There is the window still open. They believed in the mother's love and flew to their mummy and daddy one day. There is a happy ending." That was the story. Peter didn't like it because he didn't like mothers. "You're wrong about mothers, Wendy," said Peter. They all began to listen to him. "Long ago, I thought like you that my mother would always keep the window open for me. So I stayed awake for a long time and then flew back. But the window was closed and my mother forgot all about me. Another little boy was there in my bed." I am not sure that this was true, but Peter thought it was true, and it was enough to make them afraid. "Are you sure mothers are like that?" "Yes." "Wendy, let's go home," cried John and Michael together. "Yes," she said. "Not tonight?" asked the lost boys. They knew in their hearts that one can't live well without a mother. "At once," said Wendy. "Perhaps Mother begins to forget us one by one." She forgot about Peter's feelings and said to him, "Peter, will you make the necessary arrangements?" "If you want," answered Peter coldly. He didn't like parents because they always made things worse. He got inside his tree and breathed quick, short breaths because there was a saying in Neverland, "Every time you breathe, an adult dies." So Peter breathed as fast as possible. He wanted to kill them all. The boys, of course, didn't want to let Wendy go. But Peter would keep no girl in the Neverland against her will. "Wendy," Peter said, "the Redskins will take you through the forest." "Thank you, Peter." "Then Tinker Bell will take you across the sea." The boys looked at Wendy, John, and Michael in a sad way. They were going to a very nice place, and the boys wanted to go to that nice place too. "Dear ones," she said, "if you will all come with me, I can get my father and mother to have you too." They cried with happiness. "Peter, can we go?" They thought that if they went, Peter would go also. But they didn't care much about Peter's coming. They were ready to leave him at once. "All right," said Peter. "Get your things, Peter," cried Wendy. "No," he answered. "I'm not going with you, Wendy." "Yes, Peter, you are." "No." "To find your mother," said she. Now, if Peter had a mother, he didn't miss her at all. He could do very well without one. He remembered only their bad points. "No, no," he told Wendy. "Perhaps she would say I was old and I just always want to be a little boy and to have fun." "But Peter—" "No, and if you find your mother's boys, I hope you will like them," said Peter. "Now then," said he, "no cry, no word. Goodbye, Wendy." He was cold. "Are you ready, Tinker Bell?" "Yes, yes." Tink went up the nearest tree, but no one went after her, because it was at this moment that the pirates made their fearsome attack upon the redskins. Above the pirates were fighting with the redskins, and below all the children were around Peter with their mouths open. Peter got his sword, and one could see his will to fight in his eyes. Chapter 12. The Pirates Catch the Children. The pirate attack was a surprise. The redskins did not show their surprise to the white men, though. They didn't move till the pirates came closer. Then they got their knives and hatchets and began to fight. But it was too late. The pirates killed many of the redskins. The redskins killed some pirates, too. What were Hook's feelings about himself at the moment of victory? His heart must be full of happiness and pride, but his face didn't show it openly. Hook didn't come to kill the redskins only. It was Peter Pan he wanted. Wendy and the other boys, but mostly Peter Pan. But why did Hook hate Peter so much? Peter Pan was just a little boy. It was Peter's cockiness. Peter was so cocky that it made Hook angry. The question now was how to get down the trees. At this moment, what about the children? They didn't know who won the fight above. What was to happen to them from now? The pirates listened at the mouths of the trees while the boys asked this question: "Who won the fight?" They also heard Peter's answers. "If the redskins win," he said, "they will beat the tom-tom. It is always their way of showing victory." Hook was a clever man and wanted Smee to beat the tom-tom. As the boys heard the tom-tom, Peter cried, "The tom-tom! A redskin victory!" The children were now about to come up the trees without knowing the truth. The pirates smiled bitterly at each other and began to wait round each tree for the boys. Chapter 13. Do you believe in fairies? The first to come out of his tree was Curly. The pirates threw each boy to one another till he fell at the feet of the black pirate. All the boys were now on the ground. But it was different with Wendy. She was the last to come out of the tree. Hook took off his hat and gave her his arm. He did it with such an air, he was so kind, that she did not cry out. His manners affected her. She was only a little girl. The pirates tied the children so that they wouldn't fly away. All went well until Slightly's turn came. They couldn't tie him in any way. All the string would go round him, but wouldn't be long enough to tie. Poor Slightly! As soon as Hook saw this scene, he understood why each boy needed a tree of his own instead of a common one. Slightly saw Hook's face. He knew he understood their secret now. Slightly was in a panic about Peter. Hook wanted his men to carry the children to the ship, so he would be alone with Peter. The pirates took the children away singing that terrible song. I don't know whether any of the children were crying, but if so, that terrible song made the boys' cries unheard. Hook was alone now, and he thought for a moment. He wanted to make sure that he could pass through Slightly's tree. He measured the hole in the tree and saw that it was big enough to go in. The house under the ground was so silent now. Was Peter asleep, or did he stand with his sword in his hand? There was no way of knowing. He must go down. Hook stepped into the tree. He was a brave man. He let himself go into the unknown. He arrived at the house under the ground easily. His blue eyes caught the bed Peter lay on asleep. Peter didn't know about the tragedy above, because a little time after the children left, he lay on the bed in order to show that he didn't care about their going. Then he fell asleep. Sometimes Peter had dreams, but those were fearsome dreams, and he would cry in these nightmares and not wake up easily. At such times, Wendy would take him out of bed and sit with him in her arms. When he grew calmer, she would put him back to bed before he woke up. But this time he fell into a dreamless sleep. His mouth was half open. Thus helpless Hook found him. He stood silent at the foot of the tree, looking across the room at his enemy. The man was not wholly bad. He loved flowers, they told me, and sweet music. But the way Peter lay on the bed was so cocky that Hook's heart got harder and colder. Hook stood in darkness himself. At his first step he saw that he couldn't move forward, for there was the door of Slightly's tree. He couldn't reach the door's bar. It was low down. He got angry because he couldn't move the door without reaching the bar. But what was that? Hook saw Peter's medicine on a shelf in the wall. He could reach the shelf easily. As soon as he got the medicine cup, he felt Peter Pan was in his power. Hook put 5 drops of a very strong poison into Peter's cup. It would kill him at once. Hook turned and found his way with difficulty up the tree. When he got out of the tree, he put his hat on. As he went through the trees, his blackest part joined the darkness of the night. Peter slept on. Nearly by 10 o'clock, he suddenly sat up in his bed. A sound wakened him up. There was somebody at his door. He went to the door and spoke. "Who's that?" For long there was no answer. Then again the knock. "Who are you?" No answer. "I won't open unless you speak," Peter cried. "Let me in, Peter." It was Tinker Bell's voice. She flew in excitedly and told him what happened above. Peter was so excited now, he loved to be so. "I will save Wendy," he said. He thought of something that would make Wendy happy. It was his medicine. He could take it, and it would make her very happy, he knew. "No!" cried Tinker Bell. "Why not?" "It's poisoned." "Poisoned? Who could do it?" "Hook." "Don't be silly. How could he get down here?" Tink didn't know how he got down, but she heard Hook speaking to himself about it in the forest. But Peter didn't listen to Tink, and took the cup. Tink got between his lips and the cup. She drank all of it instead of Peter. "Why, Tink?" said Peter. But she was already weaker now. She flew to her bed with difficulty. Her voice was lower now, and her light was weaker. "It was poisoned, Peter," she told him softly, "and I'm gonna die." "Oh, Tink, did you drink it to save me? But why?" She said, "You silly ass," and lay down on her bed. She said that she could get well again if children believe in fairies. There were no children, and it was nighttime. But Peter called all the children sleeping now. If they dreamt of the Neverland, they would be nearer to Peter than you think. "Do you believe in fairies?" he cried. "If you believe, clap your hands. Don't let Tink die." They listened. Many clapped. Some didn't. Then suddenly the clapping stopped. But already it saved Tink. She was better now. Her voice and light grew stronger. Then she flew happily round the room. "And now to save Wendy," said Peter. The moon was up in the sky when Peter got out of his tree. He flew up sometimes went on the earth like a snake. He wasn't sure that Hook took the children to the ship, so he looked everywhere on the island. A deathly silence was on the island. The upper world called him, but would give no help. There was not a movement, not a sound. He went on his way with his sword in his hand. "Hook or me this time," he said to himself. He was very happy. Chapter 14. The Pirate Ship. The pirate ship was now on the mouth of the Pirate River. It was such a fearsome ship that no one could be brave enough to come closer to it. The darkness of the night fell upon the ship, and there was little sound. A few of the pirates were drinking while some playing cards and others sleeping heavily. Hook walked to and fro in thought. It was his night of victory. Peter was no longer a problem, and they would throw the other boys into the sea. It was a real success now. But he didn't look happy. He was quite sad. He often talked to himself on the ship when it was nighttime. It was because he was so terribly alone. When his crew was all around him, he even felt more alone. They were not socially equal to him. Hook wasn't his true name. He was at a famous school when he was a child, and he still had its traditions. His gentle manners, his rich and nice clothes were all from those traditions. But above all, he still had his will for good form. He often heard a question coming from inside. "Were you good form today?" "I am so famous," he cried. "Is it good form?" This question always made him feel uncomfortable. "No little children love me," Hook said to himself. There came a feeling over him suddenly. It was death. He felt he would die soon. He saw Smee sitting calmly on the board. Children loved him, Hook thought. Smee didn't hit the children much. He looked so sympathetic. The boys even came closer to him whenever he ran away. But why do they find Smee lovable? What was it that made him so? Good form? Hook was unhappy to find out this answer. When he heard the crew singing and dancing, he cried out loud suddenly, "Did you tie all the children so they can't fly away?" "Yes, yes," said all. "Then bring them here at once," said Hook. The pirates brought the children to the deck. They all stood in front of Hook. "You walk the plank tonight," said Hook. "Get the plank ready. You will die, boys," cried Hook. They were only little boys, and their faces went white when they saw the plank. "So, my beauty," said Hook, "you are to see your children walk the plank. You know, then they will fall into the dark sea." "Are they to die?" asked Wendy. "They are," Hook said. "Tie her up." As Smee tied Wendy, he said, "See, honey, I will save you if you will be my mother." "I wouldn't have any children instead," she said. The boys looked at the plank fearfully. Hook hoped to hear Wendy's cry when she saw the children fall into the sea. But he heard something else instead. It was the terrible tick-tick of the crocodile. A great change came over him. His face went white, and his hand, even his iron hook, began to shake. The sound came nearer. Everyone thought the same thing. The crocodile was about to climb up the ship. He got away as far from the sound as he could. Then he spoke, "Hide me!" The pirates ran and stood in front of him so that the crocodile wouldn't see Hook. But they were all afraid, and none of them wanted to fight it. The boys ran to the ship's side to see the crocodile climbing it. Then they got the strangest surprise of this night of nights, for it was not the crocodile coming to help them. It was Peter. Peter Pan. Chapter 15. Hook or me this time. Strange things happen to all of us in life. Such a thing happened to Peter that night. When we last saw him, he was passing across the island. He saw the crocodile pass by. But there was something strange. Peter remembered later that there came no sound from the crocodile. Then he understood that the clock in it stopped working. He quickly thought how he could turn it to his own use. Then he decided to make the same sound himself. This way, the wild animals would believe he was the crocodile, and they would not do him any harm. He went on his way by making the sound of tick-tick like the crocodile. But there was something that Peter didn't think of. The crocodile also heard this sound, and it went after Peter. Why did it follow Peter? We don't know. Perhaps it wanted to take back tick-tick sound, or it thought it was again itself ticking. At last Peter reached the sea, without knowing that the crocodile was coming after him. As he swam, he had just one thought, Hook or me this time. As he reached the ship, he had a wonderful idea about ticking. He would go on making this sound, so Hook would think it was the crocodile. Ed Tint came along the deck at this moment. He wanted to look at the crocodile, but Peter killed the pirate right there and threw him into the sea quickly. 1! Slightly began to count. The other pirates closed their eyes because they were so afraid. At this moment, Peter jumped into the ship silently and went into the cabin. He stopped ticking as well. "It's gone, Captain," said Smee. "Everything's okay." Slowly, Hook moved his head forward. He listened to tick-tick carefully. There was not a sound. Now he was fearsome himself again. "Then there's a plank!" Now he hated the boys more than ever because they saw him in that funny situation. He sang that terrible pirate song. "Do you want a touch of the cat before you walk the plank?" he asked. "No, no!" cried the boys. "Bring the cat, Jukes," said Hook. "It's in the cabin." The cabin! Peter was in the cabin. The children looked at each other. As Jukes walked toward the cabin, the others went on singing. The children watched Jukes carefully. The pirates couldn't finish their song because there came a sound from the cabin. It was a terrible cry. Then they heard a crowing sound too. The boys knew well about the crowing sound, but to the pirates it was not familiar. "What was that?" cried Hook. "Two," Slightly said. Italian Cecco stopped for a moment, and then he went into the cabin and got out quickly. "What's the matter with Bill Jukes?" asked Hook. "He's dead," answered Cecco. "Bill Jukes dead!" cried the pirates. "The cabin is as dark as a night," said Cecco. "But there is something terrible in there, the thing you heard crowing." "Cecco," said Hook, "go back and bring me that cat." Cecco went, although he didn't want, and they all listened. Again came a terrible cry and again crowing. No one spoke except Slightly. 3, he said. "Who is to bring me that cat?" asked Hook. None of the pirates wanted to do what their captain asked for. At last Hook said, "I think Starkey wants to go." But Starkey said he wouldn't go in any way. Hook walked toward him angrily and showed him his iron hook. Starkey looked around for help, but none of his friends was with him. He, at last, jumped into the sea. 4, said Slightly. "And now," said Hook, "I will bring that cat myself." He got a lantern and went into the cabin. 5. How Slightly wanted to say it, but Hook came out without his lantern. "Something blew out the light," he said strangely. "Something," the pirates cried. All of them were shocked. "There is a curse upon the ship," they cried. "We will die." But Hook was a clever man and said quickly, "Open the cabinet and let the children fight the thing for their lives. If they kill him, it will be better. But if he kills them, nothing changes for us." The pirates liked the idea and sent the children to the cabin at once. They closed the door on them, but they couldn't look at the door. They just listened. In the cabin, Peter found the thing he needed most, the key. He unlocked the children's hands with the key, and they all got as many knives, swords, hatchets as they could find. They got out of the cabin silently and hid themselves. Now they were ready to fight. Peter cut Wendy's ties and let her hide with the other boys. "Hook or me this time," he said, and wore Wendy's cloak. So the pirates would think he was Wendy. He gave a crowing. As soon as the pirates heard that crowing, they thought that the children were dead. They were in a panic now. They were sure that there was a curse upon them. "It is the girl," Hook said. "If a woman is on a pirate ship, there comes bad luck for the pirates." The others agreed with their captain. "Throw her into the sea," cried Hook. Mullins ran to her and said, "There is no one to save you now, Missy." "There is one, and he is Peter Pan," said Peter, and took off his cloak as he said this. Everyone was shocked, and they, at once, understood who killed the others in the cabin. "Down, boys, and at them!" Peter cried out, and the boys got into a fight with the pirates. They were attacking each other wildly. Some pirates fell into the sea, and some hid in dark places. But by lantern, Slightly found each, and let other boys kill them. Slightly went on counting. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. At last there were no pirates, except Hook on the ship. As all the boys came round Hook, Peter cried, "No, boys, this man is mine!" Thus suddenly Hook found himself face to face with Peter. The others drew back and made a ring around them. For long, the two enemies looked at one another. Peter had that strange smile upon his face. Then they began to fight wildly. Both were very clever, but Peter was faster, and he wounded Hook in the ribs. As soon as Hook saw his own blood, you remember its strange color, the sword fell from his hand. Instead of killing him, Peter waited for him to pick up his sword. Hook took it, but suddenly there came a tragic feeling that Peter was showing good form. "Pan, who and what are you?" he asked. "I am youth, I am joy, I'm a little bird coming out of the egg." Of course, these were silly words of Peter's. But Hook unhappily understood that Peter didn't know who or what he was. It was the real good form. Hook was now fighting without hope. He just wanted to see Peter's bad form before he died. We now came to Hook's last moment. He ran to the edge of the deck and waited for Peter's last movement. He thought of jumping into the sea, so he signed Peter to use his foot instead of his sword. So Peter kicked him, and Hook fell into the water, without knowing that the crocodile was waiting for him in the sea. This was James Hook's end. And Slightly counted for the last time, 17! Wendy, of course, didn't fight, but she ran to her little ones and praised them all. But the lateness of the hour was almost the biggest thing of all. Wendy put each boy into the pirates' beds in the cabin. Peter had one of his dreams that night and cried in his sleep for a long time, and Wendy held him tight in her arms. Chapter 16. The Return Home. Now we could see all the children on the pirate ship. They were so busy. Peter was the captain, of course, and they were all wearing the old pirates' clothes. They planned to go to the mainland by the ship. Then they would fly. They were on the way home now. But what happened at number 14 for all these days? Since the children left them, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were so sad. Mrs. Darling never left home for a moment, and always kept the nursery clean and the window open for her little ones. Mr. Darling blamed only himself, and he found a strange kind of punishment for himself. He thought Nana was right and he was wrong. So he said he would never leave the kennel until his children came back. He slept and sat in the kennel and went to his office in it. At first, people thought it was so strange. But when they learnt why Mr. Darling did such a thing, they felt sympathy for him. At that happy night, Mrs. Darling was playing the piano for her husband, and soon Mr. Darling fell asleep. While he slept, Wendy, John, and Michael flew into the room. "Oh no, it was not they. It is Peter and Tinker Bell." Peter's first words tell all. "Quick, Tink," he said, "close the window. That's right. When Wendy comes, she'll think her mother closed it, and she'll have to go back with me." Now I understand. It was Peter's plan from the beginning. Then they heard someone playing the piano. "It's Wendy's mother," said Peter to Tink. "She's a pretty lady, but not so pretty as my mother." Of course, he knew nothing about his mother, but he sometimes dreamt about her. But the music stopped. Peter saw Mrs. Darling put her head on the piano. There were tears on her eyes. "She wants me to open the window," thought Peter, "but I won't, not I." Yet he saw the tears were still there, and he said, "Oh, she loves Wendy so much. But I love her too. We can't both have her." But Peter couldn't leave Mrs. Darling and said at last, "Oh, all right," and he opened the window. "Come on, Tinker Bell," he cried. "We don't want any silly mothers." And he flew away. Thus Wendy, John, and Michael found the window open for them after all. Michael looked around and said, "I think I lived here before." "Of course you did, silly. This is your old bed," said John. Then they saw the kennel. "Perhaps Nana is inside it," Wendy said. But as they saw their father in it, they were surprised. "He's not so big as the pirate I killed," said Michael. It was then that Mrs. Darling began playing again. "It's Mother!" Wendy cried. "Then are you not really our mother, Wendy?" asked Michael. "Oh dear," said Wendy. "It was quite time we came back." They got into their beds and waited for their mother to come in. When Mrs. Darling went back to the nursery, she saw all her children were in their beds. But she didn't give a cry of joy. She didn't do anything, because she didn't believe they were there. She saw them in their beds so often in her dreams that she thought this was another dream of hers. She sat by the fire. The children couldn't understand this, of course, and they got out of their beds and ran to her crying, "Mother!" She was so surprised that she couldn't speak for some time. She took all her little ones in her arms, and when at last she could speak, she cried, "George, George, they came back!" It was a lovely moment when all the family got together. There was no one to see it except a strange boy. It was Peter, of course, looking in from the window. He was never to live such happy moments. Chapter 17. When Wendy Grew Up. I hope you want to know what became of the other boys. They came to the nursery too, and they stood in front of Mr. and Mrs. Darling. They said nothing, but their eyes asked the Darlings to have them. Of course they said at once they would like to have them. Then they all danced and sang together. As for Peter, he saw Wendy once again before he flew away. "Hello, Wendy, and goodbye," he said. "Oh dear, are you going away?" said Wendy. "Yes." At this moment, Mrs. Darling came to the window. She told Peter that she would have him too. "Would you send me to school?" he asked. "Yes." "And then to an office?" "Yes, I think so." "Soon I'll be a man?" "Very soon." "I don't want to go to school and learn serious things," said he. "I don't want to be a man." Mrs. Darling opened her arms toward Peter, but he said, "Keep back, lady. No one is going to catch me and make me a man." "But where are you going to live?" "With Tink in the house we built for Wendy." "How lovely!" cried Wendy. "Come with me to the little house," said Peter. "May I go, Mummy?" asked Wendy. "No, honey, I won't let you go once more," said Mrs. Darling. "But he needs a mother," said Wendy. "So do you, my love." But later Mrs. Darling said, "I will let Wendy go to you for a week every year to do your spring cleaning." This made both Wendy and Peter very happy. Because Peter had no sense of time, Wendy said, "You won't forget me, Peter, will you, before spring cleaning time comes?" Of course Peter promised, and then he flew away. He took Mrs. Darling's kiss with him. Peter took it easily. Funny, but she looked quite happy. And of course all the boys went to school, and it is sad to say that they soon forgot how to fly. When Peter came for Wendy at the end of the first year, she flew away with Peter in her dress she sewed once in the Neverland. She wanted to talk about their old adventures, but she saw that Peter forgot them all. "Who's Captain Hook?" he asked. "Don't you remember," she asked, "how you killed him and saved all our lives?" "I forget them after I kill them," he said carelessly. He even didn't remember Tinker Bell. "There are such a lot of them," he said. "I think she died." He was right, because fairies don't live long. Wendy and Peter had a lovely spring cleaning in the little house that year. Next year, he did not come for her. She waited in a new dress, but he never came. After a year, Peter came for her, and it was strange that he never knew he forgot to come last year. That was the last time Wendy saw him as a little girl. She tried not to grow up for Peter's sake, but the years came and went without bringing Peter to her. When they met again, Wendy was a married woman and was no more to her than an old adventure. By this time, all the boys grew up, and you can see them going to an office with a little bag in their hands. Even some of them got married. Wendy was married in white, and Peter didn't come to her wedding. Years went on again, and Wendy had a daughter. Her name was Jane. When she began to speak, she liked talking mostly about Peter Pan. She loved to hear of Peter and Wendy, and told her all she could remember. "Mother, tell me, how did you fly?" "It was a long time ago, honey. I can't fly now." "Why can't you fly now, Mother?" "Because I'm grown up. When people grow up, they forget the way, because they are no longer gay and innocent." Jane asked Wendy many questions about Peter Pan and the Neverland. "What did you say when you saw him on the floor crying?" she asked. "I sat up in bed," I said. "Boy, why are you crying?" "Yes, that was it," said Jane. "And what did you like most in the Neverland?" "I think I liked the home under the ground most." "Yes, so do I. What did Peter last say to you?" "Just always be waiting for me, and then some night you will hear me crowing," said Wendy. "Yes," said Jane happily. "But he forgot all about me," said Wendy with a smile. Then one night came the tragedy. It was the spring of the year, and Jane was now asleep in her bed. Wendy was sitting on the floor, very close to the fire. Then she heard a crow, and the window blew open. Peter dropped on the floor. He was the same ever, a little boy. But she was grown up, and she felt helpless now. "Hello, Wendy," said Peter. "Hello, Peter." "Where's John?" he asked. "John is not here now." "Is Michael asleep?" he asked. He didn't understand that she was grown up because the room was dark. "That's not Michael," she said quickly. "Peter, do you want me to fly away with you?" "Of course. Did you forget that this is spring cleaning time?" said Peter. Wendy smiled. "I can't come. I forgot how to fly." And then she stood up. "What is it?" Peter cried. "I will turn up the light," she said, "and then you can see for yourself." "Don't turn up the light," he said. For the first time in his life, Peter was afraid. But she turned up the light, and Peter saw. He gave a cry. "What is it?" She told him. "I am old, Peter. I grew up long ago." "You promised not to." "But I had to. I'm a married woman, Peter." "No, you're not." "Yes, and the little girl in the bed is my baby." "No, she isn't." He sat down on the floor and began to cry. Wendy was only a woman now and didn't know how to comfort him. She ran out of the room to try to think. Peter's sobs woke Jane up. She sat up in bed and asked, "Why are you crying, boy?" "Hello," said Peter. "Hello," Jane said. "My name is Peter Pan. I came back for my mother," he said, "to take her to Neverland." "Yes, I know," said Jane. "I was waiting for you." When Wendy returned, she found Peter sitting on the bed while Jane was flying round the room. "She's my mother," said Peter. Jane stood by his side and said, "He needs a mother." "Yes, I know," Wendy said. "No one knows it so well as I do." "Goodbye," said Peter to Wendy, and he flew with Jane. Wendy ran to the window. "No, no!" she cried. "It's just for spring cleaning time," said Jane. "He wants me always to do his spring cleaning." "I wish I could go with you," said Wendy. "You said you can't fly," said Jane. Of course, in the end, Wendy let them fly away together. As you look at Wendy, you can see her hair becoming white, because it happened so long ago. Jane is now a married woman with a daughter called Margaret. Every spring cleaning time, although he can forget sometimes, Peter comes for Margaret and takes her to the Neverland. He tells her stories about himself. When Margaret grows up, she will have a daughter, and this time she will be Peter's mother in turn, and it will go on as long as children are gay and innocent.